At 5:14 on a Friday afternoon, I received a 3-month project with a 2-line ultimatum finish in 48 hours, or my career ends Monday morning. By 11 that night, I discovered my boss did not want a finished project. He wanted a clean signature to bury his dirty crime. Monday morning, I walked into the boardroom and delivered right on time. Except, what I handed over did not save his seat. It opened a prison door. My name is Lydia Ward. I am 38 years old and work as a senior delivery manager at Bracken Row Systems in Denver, and I have navigated the corporate trenches long enough to understand the distinct anatomy of a deadline. There are tight deadlines, the kind that make you skip lunch and drink entirely too much stale office coffee. There are stretch deadlines, which are essentially management's way of testing whether you will break under pressure. And then, there are execution deadlines. These are not designed to be met. They are mathematically, physically, and logically engineered to ensure that whoever holds the assignment when the clock runs out is crushed beneath it. It was exactly 5:14 on a Friday afternoon. The expansive floor of our downtown office was already thinning out. The frantic energy of the workweek was bleeding away into the quiet, low hum of server towers and the faint, persistent buzz of overhead fluorescent lighting. I was in the process of locking my workstation and packing my leather tote, anticipating a quiet weekend. That was when Malcolm Raines walked into my peripheral vision. Malcolm was our chief operating officer. He was a man who moved with the silent, predatory grace of someone who had never faced a consequence he could not buy or maneuver his way out of. He did not bother to knock on the frosted glass partition of my cubicle. He simply stepped inside and dropped a massive, heavily tabbed binder directly onto the center of my desk. The sheer weight of it made a dull, heavy thud that rattled the pens in my organizer and sent a slight tremor through my half-empty coffee mug. The label pasted onto the thick spine stared back at me in bold, unforgiving letters, Beacon Grid Closeout. "I need this wrapped," Malcolm said. His voice was entirely devoid of urgency, carrying that flat, practiced calm of an executive who delegated disasters for a living. The entire handover package, finalized, verified, and ready for my desk by 7 o'clock Monday morning. I sat back slowly, letting my eyes move from the binder up to his tailored, immaculately pressed suit, Beacon Grid. It was not just a minor software patch or a routine upgrade. It was a massive, 3-month deployment project for a highly sensitive tunnel infrastructure monitoring platform, commissioned specifically for the High Plains Transit Authority. A government contract of that scale required a meticulously synchronized effort across multiple divisions. Under any normal, sane protocol, closing it out meant coordinating at least 4 distinct, highly specialized teams. You needed engineering for the technical safety sign-offs. You needed quality assurance for the rigorous testing validation packets. You needed vendor reconciliation to audit the external contractor invoices. And finally, you needed legal to provide the ultimate compliance sign-off before a single piece of hardware went live. "Malcolm, my team is currently stretched to capacity," I started to say, keeping my tone perfectly level, but I stopped the moment I recalled the strange anomaly in my inbox from earlier that day. At exactly noon, the 2 direct support leads who handled my data wrangling and cross-departmental coordination had abruptly vanished from our active internal communication channels. A sterile, automated email from Human Resources had cheerfully informed me that both employees had been temporarily reassigned to other immediate corporate priorities. They were pulled without my consent, without my prior knowledge, and without any transition plan. I was sitting in front of a 3-month, multi-departmental closeout package, and thanks to that midday maneuver, I was looking at it completely alone. Malcolm leaned forward, placing his perfectly manicured hands flat on the edge of my desk, crowding my personal space. The air around him smelled of expensive cologne and cold calculation. "This is an opportunity, Lydia," he said softly, the words sliding out like poison coated in honey. "If you can pull this off, if you can step up and save this project from the absolute mess it is currently in, I will personally make sure your name is at the top of the list during the upcoming structural reorganization." He paused, letting the silence stretch out between us. It was heavy, suffocating, and designed to make me feel small. But if you cannot deliver, his voice dropped a fraction of an octave, losing the faux encouragement and turning entirely to ice. Well, the executive board will have to seriously question your leadership capabilities moving forward. We need people who can handle the heat. I trust you are one of those people. He turned and walked away before I could offer a single word of confirmation or protest. He did not care what I had to say. The mandate was set. Less than a minute after his footsteps faded down the carpeted hallway, my computer screen chimed with a sharp ping. A new calendar invite popped up in the top right corner of my monitor. The title read, Executive Delivery Review. It was scheduled for Monday morning at exactly 8 o'clock. I clicked the mouse to open the event details, and a cold, distinct drop of sweat slid slowly down my spine. The meeting location was the main executive boardroom on the top floor, but that was not what made my stomach twist. Attached to the digital invite was a bright red system-generated tag, full audio and video recording enabled. That was fundamentally wrong. It violated every unwritten rule of corporate protocol. You do not record internal project reviews. Reviews are supposed to be safe spaces for managers to discuss roadblocks, pivot strategies, and negotiate timelines. You record disciplinary hearings. You record formal client depositions. You record things you need a permanent, legally binding trail for. I stayed at my desk for another hour. The sun dipped below the Denver skyline, casting long gray shadows across the empty cubicles. I did not open the binder. I just stared at the spine, letting the reality of the situation settle into my bones. The sheer impossibility of completing a 3-month audit in 48 hours, alone, was just the surface layer. The sudden removal of my team, the veiled threats from the chief operating officer, the recorded meeting, it was a perfectly choreographed sequence. Finally, I grabbed my coat and my bag. Leaving the binder sitting exactly where Malcolm had dropped it, I walked out of the suite, my heels clicking softly against the floorboards. As I passed the administrative bay near the elevators, I noticed the overhead lights were off, but the green standby glow of the heavy-duty security printer illuminated the counter. Someone had left a stack of freshly printed documents sitting in the output tray. They were neatly bound with clear plastic covers. Prepared specifically for Monday morning, I paused, glancing down at the top sheet. It was the printed agenda for my executive delivery review. Curiosity, or perhaps a sharp instinct for survival, made me reach out and pick up the top copy. I skimmed past the standard opening remarks and the project status review sections. My eyes tracked down to the very bottom of the page, right before the scheduled adjournment at 9 o'clock. There was a single line item that made my breath catch sharply in my throat: post-review transition and leadership reassignment. I read the words 3 times to make sure my tired eyes were not deceiving me. They had already printed the agenda for my replacement. The decision was already made. I was standing in the dim green light of an empty office building, holding absolute proof that Monday morning was not a review at all. It was an execution. I did not know exactly where the trap was hidden inside the Beacon Grid project. I did not know what specific landmine I was supposed to step on. But I understood the overarching architecture of the setup with crystal clarity. You do not bring a camera into a room and draft a leadership transition plan unless you have already decided exactly who is going to take the fall. I carefully placed the agenda back onto the stack, aligning the edges perfectly so no one would know it had been touched. I turned around, walked out to the elevator bank, and hit the button for the parking garage. The cold evening air hitting my face as I stepped out to my car did nothing to clear the sudden, razor-sharp focus settling into my mind. I was supposed to panic. I was supposed to spend the weekend tearing my hair out, trying desperately to piece together a broken project, only to walk into that boardroom exhausted, defeated, and ready to be slaughtered on camera. But that was not going to happen. I slid into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel. The clock was ticking. I had 48 hours. Not to save the project, but to find out exactly what Malcolm Raines was trying to bury, and how to use it to dig his grave instead. I did not start the engine of my car. The heavy realization of the trap anchored me firmly to the leather driver's seat. The cold steering wheel grounded my hands. But my mind was already racing back up to the 7th floor of the Bracken Row Systems building. Going home to my apartment meant playing exactly into their calculated game. It meant wasting precious hours of the weekend in blind panic. I needed the raw, unfiltered system data before the automated weekend maintenance protocols wiped the servers clean. I grabbed my keycard, locked the car door behind me, and took the silent, mirrored elevator back up to the executive levels. The office floor was entirely dead by the time I stepped out. The ambient noise of ringing phones and frantic typing was replaced by the low, continuous hum of the climate control system and the faint, eerie glow of emergency exit signs. I walked briskly past the massive beacon grid binder still sitting ominously on my desk, sat down in my chair, and immediately woke my workstation. I bypassed the standard executive summary pages and dug directly into the raw back-end dashboard. Malcolm had confidently called it a complete mess, a chaotic disaster that desperately needed saving. But the green progress bars staring back at me from the monitor told a wildly different story. As of Wednesday afternoon, the Beacon Grid project was sitting perfectly at 89% complete. The technical scaffolding was fully constructed. The software integration was green-lit across the board. The hardware sensors in the tunnel systems were communicating. It was not a failing project at all. It was practically ready to ship to the client. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the master system log directory. If the project was almost finished on Wednesday, what exactly had transpired on Friday to warrant a weekend execution mandate? I scrolled down the dense, scrolling lines of server interactions, tracking the timestamps. My breath caught in my throat. There it was, at exactly 12:07 p.m. on Friday. A massive, unprompted system rollback had been executed across the main server. It was not a glitch. It was a deliberate, manually entered command. Row after row of green confirmation codes abruptly turned red on my screen. Dozens of critical project milestones, vendor acceptance documents, and vital technical sign-offs had simply vanished from the active project workspace. They were ripped out by the digital roots. I pulled up the security permission logs next. At 4:02 p.m., barely an hour before Malcolm had casually slithered into my cubicle to drop the bomb on my desk, the system administrator had revoked all access rights for both the quality assurance team and the vendor analysts. The entire crisis was entirely manufactured. The missing documents, the locked-out engineering teams, the looming Monday disaster, all of it was artificially created mere hours before the binder was handed to me. Malcolm had intentionally broken the project himself, and then he handed me the shattered pieces with a ticking clock attached to it. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, the harsh blue light of the monitor reflecting coldly in the dark office window across from me. This was not just about my career. A cold, sinking realization washed over me as my mind categorized the events of the last 2 years at this firm. I had seen this exact scenario play out before, hiding in plain sight. 3 different senior delivery managers had been quietly pushed out under nearly identical circumstances. They were handed what the executive board graciously called rescue assignments. It was always a high-profile project, supposedly on the brink of sudden death, followed by a sudden reassignment, a desperate weekend scramble to fix the unfixable, and then a spectacular, highly public failure on Monday morning. After that, they were just gone, terminated, their desks packed up, and their names erased from the corporate directory without a single whisper of protest. I opened my archived corporate emails and ran a deep, targeted search for the departure announcements of those 3 managers. The pattern staring back at me was so blatant it was practically insulting. In every single isolated case, the impossible deadline had been aggressively pushed over a weekend. In every single case, the final review session included mandatory, documented attendance from the Human Resources Department and the Legal Counsel. And the final company-wide memo always cited the exact same sterile, legally approved phrase leadership misjudgment. This was not an isolated incident. It was a standardized playbook. A soft, deliberate rustle of fabric broke the absolute silence of the empty floor. I stiffened instantly, my hand freezing over the computer mouse. Someone else was still here. Dean Corver, the vice president of operations, materialized silently from the deep shadows of the main corridor. Dean was a corporate ghost, a man who survived endless executive purges by blending seamlessly into the background and speaking only when it was absolutely necessary for his own survival. In my entire tenure at this company, we had perhaps exchanged a dozen casual words. He did not look at me. He did not slow his measured pace. He simply walked past the frosted glass partition of my cubicle, holding a plain manila folder loosely at his side. As he passed by, his lips barely moved, and his voice was so low and gravelly it barely registered above the hum of the air conditioning unit above us. Do not use the company virtual private network tonight if you want to keep anything intact. Before my brain could fully process the gravity of the warning, he was gone, disappearing completely through the heavy fire doors leading to the emergency stairwell. My heart hammered aggressively against my ribs. The company network. If they were setting me up to fail, they would be monitoring every single keystroke, every downloaded file, and every desperate attempt I made to build a defense. If I pulled these damning logs onto my local corporate drive, the IT department could remotely wipe my hard drive and legally claim it was a corrupted security update. I needed physical evidence, and I needed to get entirely off their monitored grid. I logged out immediately, shutting the workstation down completely. I grabbed my leather tote bag and the massive beacon grid binder. Before heading to the elevator bank, I took a calculated detour to the secure printing bay down the hall. I needed to see if the administrative assistant had carelessly left anything else behind when they printed the paperwork meant to end my career earlier that afternoon. The main output trays were predictably empty, but as I glanced down at the overflow catch bin near the floor, a single sheet of heavy stock paper caught my eye. It was crumpled at the edges, clearly jammed in the rollers and hastily discarded. I pulled it out and smoothed it carefully over the cold plastic casing of the printer. It was a financial invoice, heavily redacted with thick black markers, but still showing the bottom line billing figures. The internal billing code printed at the top was tied directly to the Beacon Grid infrastructure project. My eyes aggressively scanned the itemized line items. There were 2 distinct vendor company names I had never seen in any of the original project scoping documents. They were billing massive amounts for something vaguely labeled as field stabilization. The listed costs were absolutely staggering. They were astronomically high for a service that did not even exist in our standard tunnel deployment framework. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were being systematically routed to these 2 unknown entities under the guise of stabilizing a project that, according to the system logs I just read, was already perfectly fine before Malcolm sabotaged it. I folded the heavy paper precisely and slipped it deep into the inside breast pocket of my blazer. The corporate puzzle pieces were jagged and incredibly ugly, but they were starting to form a terrifying, undeniable picture of theft. I walked back to the elevator, rode it down to the subterranean parking garage in total silence, and walked back to my parked car. The concrete structure felt damp and threateningly empty. The heavy binder weighed down my arm, a physical manifestation of the elaborate trap they had built specifically for me. I unlocked my vehicle and threw the binder aggressively onto the passenger seat. As I slid behind the wheel for the second time that night, my personal cell phone buzzed sharply in my coat pocket. It was not my monitored corporate device. Only a handful of trusted people possessed my personal phone number. I pulled the device out. The bright screen glared intensely in the dark, enclosed cabin of the car. It was a text message from an unknown number, likely routed through a masked internet gateway to hide the sender. There was no polite greeting. There was no identifying signature. There were just 2 sentences that validated every cold, paranoid suspicion I had cultivated over the last 3 hours of my life. He does not need the project finished. He needs your signature. I stared intensely at the glowing words until my phone screen timed out and faded to black. Malcolm Raines did not care about the transit authority or the tunnel infrastructure. He had intentionally broken the project, wiped the digital approval records, and secretly routed massive sums of money to ghost vendors. Now, he desperately needed a high-level scapegoat to blindly sign off on the final package. He needed someone to officially rubber-stamp the massive financial black hole he had created before the external auditors caught the scent. If I failed to deliver on Monday, I would be publicly fired for gross incompetence. If I somehow succeeded and signed the closeout documents, I would be legally bound to a massive, federal-level corporate fraud. Either way, Malcolm walked away perfectly clean, and I took the devastating fall. I pushed the ignition button, the engine roared to life, the exhaust echoing fiercely off the thick concrete walls of the garage. I pulled out of the parking space, my tires gripping the slick floor tightly. They truly believed they had trapped an exhausted middle management drone who would simply panic and blindly sign her life away to save a fleeting paycheck. They were entirely wrong. I was done playing defense. I was going to systematically dismantle his entire operation. The heavy deadbolt of my apartment door slid into place with a definitive, metallic thud, sealing me inside my own sanctuary. I did not turn on the overhead lights. The ambient street lamp glow filtering through the living room blinds was enough to guide me toward my home office setup. I dropped my leather tote onto the sofa, but I left the corporate-issued laptop exactly where it was, buried at the bottom of the bag. Dean Corver had been absolutely right. Booting up that heavily monitored machine would immediately trigger a silent alert to the network administrators. They would watch my screen, track my keystrokes, and the moment I stumbled too close to the truth, they would remotely wipe my hard drive and lock my credentials. Instead, I sat down at my personal desktop. It was a custom-built, high-performance machine I used for processing massive data sets on my own time. I woke the 3 curved monitors from their sleep state and cracked my knuckles. I was not going in through the heavily guarded front door of the corporate network. I was going to use the exact weapon Malcolm had handed me to pry open the back window. Earlier that afternoon, to ensure his paper trail looked unassailable, Malcolm had sent a formal authorization email to the entire executive IT branch. The language was deliberately broad, designed to remove any excuse I might have for failing his impossible deadline. He had written that I was granted full, unrestricted administrative override for all resources necessary to finalize the delivery package. He thought it was a brilliant legal shield. I saw it for what it truly was, a master skeleton key. I routed my connection through a secure, encrypted tunnel that bypassed the standard company tracking protocols, utilizing the specific administrative token attached to that email. I did not bother looking at the active project dashboard. I already knew Malcolm had scorched the earth there. Instead, I bypassed the primary directories entirely and dove deep into the automated server snapshot archives. Corporate enterprise systems are designed to protect themselves from accidental deletions. They take silent, comprehensive digital photographs of the entire server state every few hours. Malcolm was arrogant, but he was not an engineer. He had deleted the visible files, but he had failed to purge the shadow volumes. It took me 2 solid hours of parsing through dense, encrypted data blocks before I found the first jagged piece of the puzzle. It was a deeply nested, hidden folder masked under a string of random administrative error codes. I extracted the contents and found a series of high-definition video files. I clicked on the oldest file, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The media player opened, displaying raw, unedited footage from deep inside one of the newly constructed High Plains transit tunnels. It was a physical stress test of the automated ventilation and hazard detection systems. I watched the timestamp in the corner of the screen tick forward. A team of engineers in high-visibility vests activated a controlled smoke and gas simulator. The system was supposed to instantly detect the anomaly, trigger the emergency exhaust turbines, and flash a synchronized red warning across the transit control boards. Instead, the main hazard module flashed a sickly green, flickered violently, and then died completely. The simulated toxic gas levels on the physical monitors spiked directly into the lethal zone, yet the massive exhaust turbines remained entirely silent. The system was not just bugged. It was fundamentally, catastrophically defective. If this infrastructure went live and a fire broke out in that tunnel, hundreds of commuters would suffocate in the dark. I swallowed the dry lump in my throat and minimized the video. Malcolm was not just hiding a delayed timeline. He was actively covering up a catastrophic hardware failure that could result in mass casualties. I continued digging through the recovered snapshot, moving from the engineering archives into the compliance directories. I found a neatly formatted portable document format file labeled as the Final Readiness Certification. I opened it, and a wave of pure, ice-cold fury washed over my entire body. The certification document was flawlessly prepared. Every single technical assurance box was checked green. Every safety parameter was falsely validated. And at the very bottom of the page, sitting perfectly aligned above the final approval line, was my printed name and my official corporate title. The document was completely finished, just waiting for the system to register my digital signature. Malcolm had already drafted my confession. I needed to understand the financial motive. A cover-up of this magnitude required an incredibly lucrative incentive. I pulled the crumpled, discarded invoice from my blazer pocket and smoothed it out on my desk. I opened the master financial ledger from the server snapshot and ran a cross-reference search for the two mysterious companies Northcrest Field Services and Aldermetric Advisory. The search results populated instantly, cascading down my screen in a damning waterfall of red numbers. The scope of the theft was breathtaking. Both of these ghost vendors were billing our company for massive, six-figure payouts under the incredibly vague description of field stabilization. I pulled up the itemized dates. Both Northcrest and Aldermetric had been fully paid for providing the exact same specialized structural support service, on the exact same physical tunnel sector, during the exact same 3-week window in October. It was a physical impossibility. You cannot pay two entirely separate entities to perform the exact same labor in the exact same physical space simultaneously. It was a textbook shell company embezzlement scheme, draining the project budget dry. But the most horrifying detail was not the stolen money. It was the authorization trail. I clicked on the digital approval stamps attached to those massive vendor payouts. One of the primary authorizations carried the digital signature of Arthur Penhaligon. I stared at the screen, my blood running completely cold. Arthur had been a senior procurement director. He had suffered a massive stroke and formally resigned from the company for health reasons back in early August. Yet, according to this master ledger, Arthur had logged in and digitally approved a massive payout to Aldermetric Advisory a full 6 weeks after he had cleared out his desk and surrendered his corporate credentials. Malcolm and his accomplices were not just stealing, they were hijacking the digital identities of departed employees to sign the fraudulent checks. They were using ghosts to authorize their theft. I leaned back, pressing my palms against my tired eyes. Why the sudden rush? Why force my hand this specific weekend? I opened the master escrow and disbursement schedule tied to the High Plains Transit Authority contract. The answer glowed brightly on my center monitor. Sitting right at the top of the upcoming Tuesday morning banking manifest was a massive, conditional milestone disbursement. If the executive committee officially signed off on the project readiness during the Monday morning review, the Transit Authority's automated escrow system would instantly release a final payment of $14,600,000 into our corporate accounts. Malcolm was racing against the clock. He needed to unlock that massive payday, route his final cut through his ghost vendors, and secure his promotion before the entire defective tunnel system inevitably collapsed, and the federal investigators swarmed the building. I was about to sever my connection to the archive when my eyes caught a tiny anomaly in the communication sync logs. It was a minuscule audio file, deliberately mislabeled as a routine background system error rather than a voice recording. It had been captured and stored by the automated compliance software before someone had attempted to manually scrub it. I plugged my heavy studio headphones into my desktop and pressed play. For a second, there was only the hollow sound of static and the faint rustle of clothing. Then, a heavy oak door clicked shut. Malcolm's voice cut through the silence. It was crisp, dripping with arrogance, and completely devoid of human empathy. He was clearly speaking to someone else in his private office, though the second voice was too muffled to identify. "Do not worry about the compliance audit," Malcolm said smoothly, the digital recording capturing every cold syllable perfectly. "By Monday, she will own the mess." I stopped the recording. I took off my headphones and laid them gently on the polished wood of my desk. The silence in my apartment felt entirely different now. The panic that had been tightly coiled in my chest since 5:14 that afternoon completely evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, hyper-focused calm. I finally understood the entire architecture of the game. This was never a broken project that required a desperate, last-minute savior. This was a meticulously constructed, multi-million-dollar crime scene. And Malcolm Rains had specifically handpicked me to be the naive, terrified fall guy found standing over the body, holding the murder weapon. They expected me to spend the next 48 hours drowning in anxiety, desperately trying to fix unfixable code, only to walk into that boardroom completely broken and ready to sign whatever they put in front of me just to survive. I looked at the forged certification document still glowing on my screen. I was not going to fix their broken project. Was going to use the next 48 hours to build the case against him. And on Monday morning, I was going to make sure Malcolm Rains was the one trapped by it. It was well past midnight when I picked up my cell phone to make the first call. The glowing screen illuminated my dark living room. I dialed the number for Tessa Corbin. 10 months ago, Tessa had been the lead quality assurance engineer for our entire Western Division. She was brilliant, meticulous to a fault, and fiercely protective of the junior analysts working beneath her. Then, practically overnight, she was publicly terminated. The official company statement claimed she had failed to complete a critical validation package, jeopardizing a major client deliverable. It was a brutal, humiliating exit that effectively blacklisted her across the entire Denver technology sector. The phone rang 5 distinct times before she finally picked up. Her voice was thick with sleep, but it hardened into immediate, guarded hostility the second I stated my first and last name. "If Human Resources sent you to fish for a non-disclosure agreement breach, Lydia, you can tell them I am still strictly adhering to the corporate gag order," Tessa said sharply. "I have absolutely nothing to say about Bracken Row Systems. Do not call this number again." I did not offer standard polite pleasantries. I did not apologize for waking her up in the middle of the night. I simply read the 2 vendor names aloud into the receiver, letting the words hang in the heavy silence. Northcrest Field Services, Alder Metric Advisory. The line went entirely dead for a long, heavy moment. I could hear the faint, distant sound of a police siren wailing somewhere in her neighborhood, echoing through the phone speaker. When Tessa finally spoke again, the defensive, angry armor in her voice had completely shattered. It was replaced by a quiet, raw exhaustion that made my chest physically ache. "So," Tessa whispered, her voice cracking slightly. Someone finally looked in the right place. Tessa had not gone down without securing a digital lifeboat, even if she had been far too terrified of corporate retaliation to ever use it. While we stayed on the open line, she forwarded a heavily encrypted compressed file directly to my secure personal Dropbox. It contained a series of high-definition screen recordings she had quietly captured during her final, frantic weeks at the firm. "Watch the timestamps," she instructed me, breathing heavily into the phone. I opened the video files. They documented the internal project tracking software. In the absolute dead of night, usually between 2 and 4 in the morning, the administrative logs showed Malcolm's unique executive identifier logging into the back-end system. I watched in real time as his account manually unlocked sealed testing milestones. He was deliberately altering the fail states to passing grades, deleting the error reports, and then relocking the digital vaults before the morning engineering shift arrived. "He is not just skimming money off the top of the budget, Lydia," Tessa explained, the lingering trauma of her destroyed career bleeding into every word. "He is actively burying catastrophic hardware failures. If that tunnel infrastructure goes live and fails, it is a massive federal disaster. People will be hurt. But if the project freezes right now for an external safety audit, the board of directors will look closely at the budget discrepancies. The current chief executive officer is retiring in January. Malcolm desperately wants that chair. He needs a perfectly clean launch and a massive profit margin to secure the board's vote. I flagged a massive safety discrepancy on a Tuesday afternoon. By Friday afternoon, I was handed a catastrophic rescue assignment that was mathematically impossible to finish. On Monday morning, I was escorted out of the building by private security like a common criminal. I thanked Tessa, promising her I would make this right, though I did not yet know exactly how the pieces would fall. My next phone call was to Owen Hale. Owen used to be our senior procurement manager. He was a quiet, incredibly thorough man who kept a framed photograph of his two daughters permanently fixed to the corner of his desk. He had been quietly forced into an early, stripped-down retirement under the vague, unprovable pretense of causing a delayed bidding process. When I finally reached him, he sounded utterly defeated. The bright spark of his professional pride had been entirely extinguished. I simply asked for a physical corporate address, Owen told me, his voice barely registering above a whisper. I saw those two strange vendor names popping up repeatedly on the external routing sheets. They were pulling massive, six-figure invoices, but they had absolutely no commercial footprint. There were no equipment staging areas, no union contractor safety badges, nothing. I sent exactly one email to Malcolm requesting a standard site verification for Northcrest and Alder Metric. Exactly 3 weeks later, my entire department was aggressively audited by outside counsel. They dug up a minor compliance delay from 2 years prior, blew it entirely out of proportion, and told me I could either resign quietly that afternoon or lose my entire accrued pension. I have a heavy mortgage. Lydia. I had 2 college tuitions to pay. I put my head down, signed their paperwork, and walked away in absolute shame. The pattern was solidifying into indestructible concrete. Anyone who even accidentally brushed against the vendor billing anomalies or the safety sign-offs was immediately targeted for elimination. I had one more corporate ghost to contact. Marisol Dane had been a rising star in the company. She was a brilliant implementation director who had suddenly and inexplicably fallen from grace late last year. She answered the phone on the very first ring, sounding completely awake and entirely unsurprised, almost as if she had been sitting in the dark waiting for this exact phone call for over 12 months. They are incredibly good at weaponizing your own work ethic against you, Marisol said bitterly, the anger radiating through the cellular connection. You think you are being a dedicated team player. You think you are pushing critical tasks across the finish line for the good of the division. Malcolm caught me in the hallway one afternoon between consecutive meetings. He handed me a single-page printed memo. He casually said it was just a routine sign-in sheet confirming my mandatory attendance at a vendor alignment briefing. I was rushing to my next presentation. I trusted him. I signed it. She paused, taking a ragged breath. 2 weeks later, the integration project crashed hard, and that exact same piece of paper surfaced in a formal executive disciplinary review, only it was no longer a simple sign-in sheet. The top descriptive paragraph had been entirely swapped out. My signature was sitting at the bottom of an explicit, legally binding approval for a massive, completely unvetted change order that authorized a massive payout. I was fired on the spot for gross financial negligence. It took me 8 excruciating months to find a job that paid exactly half of what I was making before, and I still wake up in a cold sweat thinking about that damn piece of paper. I ended the call with Marisol and pushed myself away from the desk. I stood in the center of my home office, staring blindly at the dark monitors. The air in my apartment felt heavy, thick with the collected grief and humiliation of these broken professionals. Tessa, Owen, Marisol. They were not just acceptable collateral damage in a corporate spreadsheet. They were incredibly dedicated, hard-working people who had spent decades meticulously building their careers and their reputations. They had families to support, they had professional integrity, and Malcolm had casually, ruthlessly shredded their lives to protect his own criminal ambition. He deliberately isolated them, handed them impossible deadlines, and destroyed them in front of human resources so they would never be viewed as credible witnesses if they ever tried to speak out. A profound, irreversible shift occurred within me at that precise moment. When I had driven home earlier this evening, my primary objective had been pure, desperate self-preservation. I simply wanted to survive the impending Monday morning ambush. I wanted to build a strong enough shield to deflect the bullet Malcolm had fired directly at my head. I wanted to save my own job and walk away clean. But listening to the raw, lingering trauma in the voices of my former colleagues fundamentally changed the entire calculus of my survival. Surviving was no longer nearly enough. Walking away clean was no longer an acceptable outcome. Malcolm Raines had built a remarkably efficient, bloodthirsty machine designed specifically for grinding up human careers and turning them into convenient stepping stones for his own executive ascension. He had weaponized the very concept of professional dedication and corporate loyalty. He relied entirely on the cold calculation that corporate adults, burdened with heavy mortgages, dependent families, and a desperate need for a severance package, would simply lower their heads and accept the unjust blame rather than fight a massive corporate legal team. I looked at the encrypted video files Tessa had sent me, the undeniable structural evidence of a sociopath gaming the entire system for his own gain. He thought I was just another fragile target, another middle manager who would weep in the boardroom and sign a false confession just to escape the pressure. I was not just going to clear my own name on Monday morning. I was going to systematically dismantle the ruthless machine that had destroyed my friends. I was going to gather the shattered pieces of their stolen reputations, forge them into an absolute, undeniable weapon, and drive it straight through the heart of his corporate empire. I cleared my physical desk. Sweeping aside my personal mail and coffee cups, I grabbed a stack of blank printer paper and a thick black marker. I started mapping the data points. I created a visual matrix across the surface of my desk, connecting the disparate dots between the fraudulent invoices, the deleted server logs, the hidden audio recording, the scheduled transit authority disbursement, and the exact dates my former colleagues were unceremoniously pushed out of the company. When I drew the final connecting lines, the chaotic web of corporate sabotage snapped into a perfectly straight, terrifying line. I needed to know exactly where the money was bleeding out. I accessed the State Department of Revenue public database, using a secure proxy server to mask my digital footprint. I searched the corporate registry for Northcrest Field Services and Alder Metric Advisory. The search results loaded instantly. They shared the exact same registered agent and the exact same physical address. It was a nondescript office suite situated in a suburban business park just outside the Denver city limits. I ran a cross-reference search on that specific commercial suite number. The database processed the request and spit back a direct match that made my jaw clench so hard my teeth ached. It was the registered headquarters for Raines Horizon Properties. It was a private real estate investment firm owned entirely by our beloved Chief Operating Officer, Malcolm Raines. He was literally approving massive corporate payouts to his own holding company. The vague field stabilization change orders were nothing more than a crude, highly effective money laundering pipeline. He was siphoning cash directly out of the transit authority budget to fund his personal real estate ventures, using ghost vendors to magically erase the transaction trail. The financial theft was massive, but the deleted safety test videos were apocalyptic. I reviewed the hidden footage again, watching the simulated smoke fill the concrete transit tunnel while the system remained entirely dead. The ventilation error was not a minor calibration glitch that could be quietly patched in a later software update. It was a fundamental architectural failure in the hardware integration. If I placed my digital signature on the final readiness certification, and those tunnels went live to the public, the toxic exhaust buildup would not just trigger a corporate fine. It would trigger a massive federal criminal investigation the moment commuters started collapsing from carbon monoxide poisoning. I went back into the server shadow volume, digging deeper into the administrative sandbox. I bypassed the engineering files and targeted the human resources directory. I found a hidden subfolder titled with my specific employee identification number. Inside was a draft memorandum. The creation date was Friday afternoon, a full 2 hours before Malcolm even walked into my cubicle to hand me the massive project binder. It was my official termination letter. The document was impeccably drafted by the legal team, It stated that effective Monday afternoon, my employment at Bracken Row Systems was terminated immediately due to gross negligence in delivery governance. My execution was already written, legally approved by Human Resources, and waiting patiently in the chamber. The entire weekend rescue mission was a spectacular sham designed to provide them with the documented failure they needed to fire me for cause, thereby denying me any severance package or unemployment benefits. Sitting right next to my termination letter in the same directory was a finalized, updated organizational chart scheduled for company-wide distribution on Tuesday morning. My name was completely erased from the senior management tier. Sitting squarely in my senior delivery manager box was Soren Pike. Soren was Malcolm's young, fiercely loyal right-hand man. He was an aggressive junior executive who had been shadowing the Beacon Grid project for weeks, offering absolutely no tangible help but taking meticulous notes during every single meeting. He was the designated successor. Malcolm was rewarding Soren with my salary and my title in exchange for keeping his mouth shut and looking the other way while the project was intentionally driven into the ground. I needed to know if the entire executive board was corrupted, or if Malcolm was running this operation entirely rogue. I breached the internal legal counsel archive. I was specifically looking for any communication between Malcolm and our chief legal officer, Celia Voss. Celia was a notorious corporate shark. She was a woman who sat perfectly still in executive meetings, observing everyone with cold, unblinking eyes, and only spoke to officially kill a legal liability. Deep inside her dormant case files, I found a flagged entry from 6 months prior. It was a heavily redacted, anonymous whistleblower complaint detailing suspected vendor fraud on the transit project. It had to be the complaint Owen Hale had tried to escalate before he was forced into early retirement. Celia had not buried it. She had placed the file under an active, covert legal hold. She had attached a private, encrypted note stating that the allegation required definitive, irrefutable technical and financial proof before she could bypass Malcolm and initiate a formal board of directors investigation. She knew something was rotting in the floorboards of the operations department, but she did not have the exact coordinates of the body, and she was far too smart to strike at a powerful chief operating officer without a fully loaded gun. All the jagged pieces slammed together at once. The forensic picture was flawless. Malcolm was not just stealing cash, he was building an incredibly lucrative bomb. He needed the project falsely certified to unlock the massive payment of $14,600,000 from the Transit Authority on Tuesday morning. But he also knew the catastrophic tunnel failure was a ticking time bomb that would inevitably detonate once the public transit system opened. He could not afford to have his own digital signature anywhere near that final readiness certification when the federal inspectors eventually arrived to sift through the wreckage. He needed a designated survivor to take the ultimate fall. He needed my signature to simultaneously open the bank vault and lock my own prison cell. If I failed to deliver on Monday, I was fired for incompetence, and Soren would step in to sign the forged documents as the new hero. If I panicked and actually signed the documents to save my job, I became the sole legal owner of a massive, fatal infrastructure fraud. I sat back in my chair, the sharp glow of the 3 monitors illuminating the dark room. I had everything. I had the financial trail, the deleted safety logs, the termination drafts, and the precise motive. Malcolm had given me 48 hours to dig my own grave. He did not realize he had just handed me the evidence I was going to use to bring him down. I made a definitive choice right then and there. I was going to deliver the requested package exactly on schedule. When Monday morning arrived, Malcolm would get exactly what he demanded: a comprehensive, finalized closeout report sitting squarely on the boardroom table. The only minor deviation from his master plan was that my package would not legalize his fraudulent project. It would categorically indict him. I spent the entirety of Saturday building the case. I created a master directory and titled it The Final Delivery Package. I architected it into 3 distinct, impenetrable layers. The first layer was the raw technical timeline. I meticulously mapped the pristine, functional state of the tunnel monitoring system from Wednesday. immediately followed by the malicious manual rollbacks executed on Friday afternoon. The second layer was the irrefutable financial evidence. I cross-referenced the ghost vendor invoices with the corporate registry documents tying those exact shell companies directly to Malcolm. The third and final layer was the psychological premeditation. I compiled the drafted termination letter, the updated organizational chart featuring his loyal subordinate, and the revoked access logs, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that my public failure had been scripted days before the deadline was ever assigned. But digital evidence living on a single machine is incredibly fragile, especially when the target controls the overarching corporate network. I needed to ensure this information survived even if they tried to physically confiscate my devices. I began the distribution protocol. I routed the first complete digital copy directly into the deepest, most secure vault of our internal corporate audit system, intentionally flagging it under a mandatory, non-negotiable legal hold. By invoking that specific compliance protocol, not even a chief executive officer could delete the file without triggering a permanent, unalterable system alert to federal regulators. I encrypted the second copy and transmitted it to a high-powered private labor attorney I had retained over a brief, intense phone call earlier that morning. The third copy was the most dangerous, but also the most necessary. I drafted a heavily secured, anonymous email and sent the entire dossier directly to the External Contract Oversight Director at the High Plains Transit Authority. I programmed the email to release on a time delay, set to hit their government inbox exactly 10 minutes after my scheduled review began. Digital redundancy was established, but corporate warfare often devolves into physical standoffs. If Malcolm felt cornered, he would simply kill the projector, order the internal network shut down, and claim I had suffered a mental breakdown and lost all my data. I was not going to give him that luxury. I drove to an all-night commercial print shop 2 towns over to avoid any local corporate surveillance. I stood under the harsh fluorescent lights and personally printed 3 massive, comprehensive hard copies of the entire dossier. I used high-grade, heavy stock paper. I had them professionally bound with thick, transparent covers and solid black spines. I pulled out my label maker and attached a distinct, undeniable title to each binder. The first read, Executive Review. The second read, Legal Hold. The third read, Client Oversight. If they cut the power to the boardroom, I would simply slide these physical anchors across the mahogany table and force them to read their own demise under the emergency lights. To counter the inevitable network blackout, I circumvented the corporate technology infrastructure entirely. I built the entire slide deck presentation inside an isolated, standalone demonstration environment. I loaded it onto a secondary, clean tablet that had never once connected to the Bracken Row system's intranet. I set up a dedicated, heavily encrypted personal cellular hotspot. When I walked into that room, I would bring my own internet, my own hardware, and my own indisputable narrative. They could pull the Ethernet cables out of the walls, and my presentation would not even flicker. By Sunday afternoon, my war room was perfectly ordered. I was reviewing the physical binders when my secure personal inbox chimed with a new, encrypted message. I opened it, expecting a final piece of confirmation from the labor attorney. Instead, I found a raw calendar export file sent from an untraceable internal relay address. I did not need to guess the sender. Dean Corver had struck again from the shadows. I opened the exported schedule. It was a restricted executive-level calendar view of Malcolm's activities over the past 2 weeks. Dean had highlighted a single, glaring entry from last Thursday. An external, independent compliance check had been formally scheduled by the Transit Authority to verify the tunnel ventilation safety protocols. Just 4 hours before those external inspectors were supposed to arrive, Malcolm had unilaterally canceled the walkthrough. His attached justification note cited a minor, localized scheduling conflict. The truth, glowing brightly on my screen thanks to the Vice President of Operations, was that Malcolm had intentionally barred the doors. He knew the system was critically defective, and he had to keep the outside world blind until he could force my signature onto the readiness certification and secure his massive payday. Dean had just handed me the final, devastating proof of a deliberate, calculated cover-up. A fleeting thought crossed my mind to confront Malcolm on Sunday evening. I could have easily sent him a single screenshot of the ghost vendor registry, effectively holding a gun to his head and forcing him to resign quietly before the market opened. It would have been cleaner. It would have been safer. But safe was not the objective anymore. Confronting him privately gave him an opportunity to spin the narrative, to sacrifice a lower-level pawn, or to quietly leverage his immense wealth to bury the evidence and escape. He had publicly humiliated and destroyed Tessa, Owen, and Marisol. He had engineered my execution to be a theatrical, recorded event designed to elevate his own status. He wanted a spectacle. I was going to give him one. I needed him to walk into that boardroom on Monday morning feeling absolutely invincible. I needed him to sit directly in his leather chair of power, surrounded by the chief executive officer, the legal counsel, the human resources director, and the unblinking eye of the recording camera. I needed his ego fully inflated so the resulting explosion would leave absolutely nothing behind. Sunday night descended over the city. The apartment was entirely silent. I packed the 3 heavy binders into my rigid leather briefcase. I placed the clean presentation tablet and the cellular hotspot into the side compartment. I checked the brass locks on the briefcase, securing them with a satisfying metallic click. I walked into my bedroom and opened my closet. I bypassed the standard business casual attire I usually wore for internal meetings. I selected the most conservative, heavily structured, dark charcoal suit I owned. It was the kind of suit you wore to a federal deposition or a funeral. I laid it out meticulously, ensuring there was not a single wrinkle in the fabric. I chose a simple, unadorned white silk blouse. There would be no bright colors, no distracting jewelry, absolutely nothing that could detract from the cold, hard gravity of the data I was about to present. I set my alarm for 5 o'clock in the morning. I lay down in the dark, staring up at the ceiling, feeling an incredibly strange, icy calm washing over my entire body. I was not anxious. I was not afraid. The frantic, terrified middle manager who had stared at that impossible deadline on Friday afternoon was completely gone, burned away by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. Malcolm had meticulously arranged every single detail for a Monday morning execution. He had invited the audience, he had set up the cameras, he had built the gallows. He fully expected me to walk through those glass boardroom doors, lower my head in absolute defeat, and beg for professional mercy. He was right about one thing. Someone was definitely going to be destroyed on camera tomorrow morning. But as I closed my eyes and let the darkness take over, I knew exactly who was bringing the sentence. The air in the executive suite on the top floor always felt artificially thin, filtered through layers of expensive climate control until it lacked any real substance or warmth. At exactly 10 minutes to 7 on Monday morning, I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the primary conference room. The expansive space was completely prepped and waiting. It did not resemble a standard project check-in or a routine operational sync. It was a flawlessly staged arena constructed entirely for a public execution. A sleek black lens of a high-definition recording camera was mounted directly beneath the massive primary display monitor on the far wall. Its small red recording indicator light was already blinking rhythmically, capturing every breath and movement in the room. The seating arrangement was aggressively formal. The chief executive officer sat at the absolute head of the long mahogany table, nursing a ceramic cup of black coffee, his expression masked in neutral impatience. The director of human resources sat to his immediate left, her hands folded tightly over a generic yellow legal pad, deliberately avoiding eye contact with me as I walked past her chair. Soren Pike had positioned himself strategically near the heavy wooden exit doors. He wore a brand-new, sharply tailored navy suit that screamed of unearned confidence. On the polished wood directly in front of him rested a pristine, shrink-wrapped binder. He sat perfectly straight, practically vibrating with nervous, predatory anticipation. He was ready to step right over my corporate corpse and take control of the division the exact second the human resources director read my termination clause into the official record. Malcolm Raines stood near the panoramic floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the waking Denver skyline. He turned gracefully as I walked in. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silver tie perfectly knotted at his throat. His smile was flawless, practiced, and utterly chilling. He was playing the role of the deeply concerned, supportive mentor to absolute perfection. "Lydia," Malcolm said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet room, perfectly modulated to ensure the microphones picked up every drop of his manufactured empathy. "Good morning. I know it was a grueling weekend. Did you manage to get any sleep at all?" He was acting as if he had not spent the entire weekend setting the trap. He was speaking softly, wrapping his poison in velvet, so that anyone watching the recording back later would think he was a remarkably kind executive forced to deal with a tragically incompetent manager. I did not offer him a polite smile. I did not show him a single ounce of the exhaustion or the terror he desperately wanted to see. I simply pulled out my leather chair, placed my rigid briefcase on the table, and looked right through him. "I am fully prepared for the review, Malcolm," I replied smoothly, my tone as flat and unyielding as the concrete in his defective transit tunnels. Before Malcolm could respond, the heavy glass doors swung open again. Celia Voss, our chief legal officer, walked into the room. Her arrival immediately shifted the atmospheric pressure of the entire space. Celia never arrived early to internal project reviews, and she certainly never attended technical delivery meetings unless a lawsuit was actively pending. She walked straight past Malcolm without acknowledging his polite nod. She carried a thick manila envelope sealed tightly with red, tamper-evident evidence tape. She stopped at the head of the table and placed the sealed envelope squarely on the polished wood, directly in front of the chief executive officer. She did not say a single word. She just sat down in the empty chair to his right, folded her hands, and stared blankly at the far wall. For the very first time since Friday afternoon, I felt a genuine tremor of uncertainty ripple through the room. I watched Malcolm's left eye twitch, just a millimeter, at the sight of that sealed envelope. He knew Celia was a silent predator, and her presence was not part of his carefully orchestrated script. Not everyone in this room was standing on his side of the board. A soft chime echoed from the ceiling speakers, drawing our attention to the massive display monitor. A high-definition video feed connected us directly to the High Plains Transit Authority offices. The external client liaison, a stern government official with graying hair, sat in his own austere office on the screen. Malcolm had specifically invited the client to witness this internal review. It was a calculated, incredibly arrogant gamble. He assumed the imposing presence of the government client would terrify me into total, unquestioning compliance. He believed I would be too scared to cause a scene in front of the buyer, forcing me to quietly sign the final readiness certification and instantly unlock the escrow funds. Malcolm took his designated seat, signaling the official start of the meeting. He leaned toward the center microphone. "I want to officially open this delivery review," Malcolm began, his voice taking on a formal, solemn cadence. "First and foremost, I want the record to reflect our deep corporate appreciation for the extraordinary weekend rescue efforts of our senior delivery manager, Lydia Ward. As we all know, the Beacon Grid infrastructure project encountered severe, unforeseen turbulence late last week. Lydia stepped into a highly volatile situation at the 11th hour. We are here today to determine if those dedicated efforts were sufficient to finalize the client handover." It was a brilliant, terrifying opening statement. To any outside auditor listening to the tape, it sounded like a benevolent leader giving a struggling employee one final, desperate chance to succeed. He was building the gallows right in front of me, painting the wood white, and calling it a pedestal. I stood up slowly. I did not reach for the massive, sabotaged project binder he had dumped on my desk on Friday. I left it sitting exactly where it belonged, completely out of sight. I opened my briefcase. I pulled out my clean, independent demonstration tablet. I did not ask the IT administrator for the guest network password. I activated my heavily encrypted personal cellular hotspot, linking it directly to the boardroom projection system. They could cut the Ethernet lines in the walls right now, and they still would not be able to stop what was coming. "Thank you, Malcolm," I said, my voice ringing with the calm, absolute authority of a project lead delivering a perfectly standard weekly status update. The primary objective of a delivery review is complete transparency. My goal today is to provide a comprehensive, unvarnished look at the exact state of the beacon grid deployment, tracing the data from its inception to the events of this past Friday. I tapped the screen of my tablet. The projector hummed loudly, casting a bright rectangular glow against the far wall. The very first slide of my presentation appeared on the screen. It was a masterclass in corporate camouflage. It featured the standard company logo, a deep navy blue background, and a boring, perfectly formatted bulleted agenda covering scope, timeline, and dependencies. It looked exactly like every other mind-numbing corporate presentation ever delivered in this building. The Human Resources Director relaxed her posture slightly. Soren Pike smirked, clearly thinking I was about to launch into a pathetic, desperate defense of my technical failures. Malcolm leaned back in his expensive leather chair, steepling his fingers, looking incredibly satisfied with his own genius. They were all completely lulled by the sterile, familiar formatting of that first slide. None of them had the slightest idea that the second slide in the deck was about to blow apart Malcolm's entire plan and change the future of the division. I began my presentation with a measured, utterly benign cadence. The first slide illuminated the dark boardroom with a perfectly standard, unthreatening corporate timeline. I walked the room through the original scope of the tunnel infrastructure framework, detailing the initial design phases and the critical milestone delivery dates. I spoke at length about the external vendor dependencies and the designated testing windows that had been established months ago. It was corporate poetry, dry, predictable, and entirely devoid of conflict. The strategy worked exactly as I had calculated. The sheer mundane nature of the data forced everyone in the room to lower their guard. The chief executive officer took another slow, deliberate sip of his black coffee, his eyes glazing over slightly as he settled back into his heavy leather chair. The director of human resources actually let her silver pen drop onto her yellow legal pad, deciding that nothing immediately actionable or legally dangerous was going to happen in the next 5 minutes. Soren Pike slouched back against the wall near the exit, crossing his arms over his chest, projecting an aura of supreme, arrogant boredom. Malcolm Raines smiled benevolently from his seat at the center of the table, clearly assuming I was simply delaying the inevitable, pathetic confession of my absolute failure to meet his deadline. I let the comfortable silence stretch for exactly 3 seconds. Then, I tapped the screen of my personal demonstration tablet. The slide transitioned instantly. The soothing navy background vanished, replaced by a glaring, high-contrast overlay of raw server administration logs. The sudden appearance of dense, heavily coded text on an executive presentation screen was visually jarring. The atmosphere in the room shifted in a fraction of a second. "This," I stated, my voice losing its corporate softness and sharpening into a cold, unyielding blade, "is the actual verified project status of the beacon grid deployment as of noon this past Wednesday. As you can clearly read on the system monitors, the entire technical deployment was sitting securely at 89% completion." I paused, ensuring the chief executive officer was tracking the data line I had highlighted in bright yellow. Then, I tapped the screen a second time. A thick, aggressive red line slashed diagonally across the entire data set. "And this," I continued, projecting my voice clearly toward the recording microphones in the ceiling, "is the manual, unauthorized system rollback executed at exactly 7 minutes past 12 in the afternoon on Friday. Hundreds of critical testing validations, finalized engineering sign-offs, and completed infrastructure milestones were intentionally purged from the Active Directory. The project was not failing. It was actively gutted and entirely hollowed out just 5 hours before the binder was placed on my desk." The room fell dead silent. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the climate control vents. I did not give them a single moment to process the implication. I struck again immediately, advancing to the third slide, the screen filled with the security permission architecture logs. "Furthermore," I said, locking eyes with the camera lens, ensuring the external client liaison heard every single syllable. At 4 in the afternoon on Friday, all system access rights for the primary quality assurance team and the vendor analysis unit were unilaterally revoked by a master administrative override. No competent operations leader deliberately blinds their own engineering teams, strips them of their diagnostic tools, and then demands a sole manager fix a sabotaged multi-million-dollar infrastructure project in exactly 48 hours. Malcolm shattered the heavy silence. He slammed his hand flat against the mahogany table, the loud crack echoing violently off the glass walls. The benevolent mentor mask had completely melted off his face, replaced by a flush of dark, uncontrolled anger. "This is absolutely absurd," Malcolm snapped, his voice tight and unnaturally pitched with sudden, barely concealed panic. "You are clearly buckling under the pressure of your own incompetence. Lydia, you are wildly misinterpreting fragmented technical logs that you have absolutely no administrative authority to audit. I will not sit here in my own boardroom and let you invent paranoid conspiracy theories to cover your complete inability to deliver on a critical client deadline." I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice defensively. I simply reached into my rigid leather briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of heavy stock paper. I slid it smoothly across the polished wood, stopping it exactly in front of the chief executive officer. "Actually, Malcolm," I replied calmly, keeping my posture perfectly straight, "you personally granted me that exact authority. That document is the formal email you sent to the Executive Technology Branch on Friday afternoon. You explicitly gave me full access to any systems and internal resources necessary to finalize this delivery package. You signed it yourself. I simply used the master key you handed me." The chief executive officer picked up the paper, reading the printed email in total silence. His jaw tightened into a hard, unforgiving line. He slowly lowered the paper and looked directly at Malcolm. The air in the room grew instantly, suffocatingly cold. Celia Voss, the chief legal officer, did not move a muscle, but her eyes locked onto Malcolm with the terrifying intensity of a predator watching its prey step blindly into a steel trap. Before Malcolm could attempt to spin another frantic lie, I reached down and triggered the embedded media player on my tablet. The boardroom speakers crackled to life. The audio file was crystal clear, completely devoid of static or background interference. It was just Malcolm's voice, captured perfectly by the automated compliance software, dripping with absolute arrogant finality. "I do not need perfect. I need signed." The recording lasted only a few seconds, but the acoustic impact within those glass walls was seismic. On the massive display monitor at the far end of the room, the external client liaison from the High Plains Transit Authority abruptly ended his charade of polite, neutral observation. He leaned sharply forward, his face suddenly filling the entire screen. He pulled a thick, heavy binder toward him, uncapped a silver pen, and glared directly into his webcam. "I want it clearly stated for the official record right now," the client liaison demanded, his voice booming through the overhead speakers with absolute, uncompromising governmental authority. "No one is to terminate this call. No one is to mute the audio feed. You will proceed with this presentation immediately, Ms. Ward, and you will not omit a single detail." In less than 5 minutes, the entire gravitational pull of the room had violently inverted. I was no longer the desperate, exhausted employee standing on trial, pleading for my career and my reputation. The elaborate trap had sprung with devastating force, but it had not caught me. Malcolm Raines was completely exposed. He sat rigidly in his expensive leather chair, his knuckles entirely white as he gripped the armrests, staring blankly at the undeniable wreckage of his own master plan. He was no longer presiding over my public execution. The room had changed owners. Malcolm was now the one who desperately needed to explain exactly why he had intentionally broken a massive transit project, and more importantly, he was going to have to explain exactly what he was trying to hide beneath the digital rubble. Malcolm Raines did exactly what cornered predators do when the initial trap fails to snap their prey. He aggressively pivoted, attempting to control the narrative by sacrificing external targets. The blood rushed to his face, but he forced his voice into a tone of loud, righteous indignation, leaning heavily over the polished mahogany table. "You are grasping at completely disconnected data fragments." "Lydia," Malcolm countered, his voice booming with forced authority. "Yes, the system experienced a major synchronization failure on Friday. Yes, I had to revoke access to prevent the engineering teams from corrupting the core architecture any further. And yes, those two external vendors grossly overstepped their billing mandates. I was quietly investigating their invoices all weekend. You are taking standard crisis management protocols and wildly stringing them together to save your own skin because you could not handle the pressure of the deadline." I did not raise my voice to meet his shouting. I did not engage with his desperate, emotional theatrics. Emotional arguments in a boardroom are designed to muddy the waters. I was there to drain the swamp completely dry. I tapped the screen of my tablet. The administrative logs vanished from the primary display monitor, instantly replaced by high-resolution scans of state ownership filings, certified mailing addresses, and federal tax identification documents. "I am not interpreting data, Malcolm," I said, my voice completely devoid of any heat, striking the room like a physical blow. "I am following the payment trails. These are the certified ownership registries for Northcrest Field Services and Alder Metric Advisory. They do not possess external commercial staging areas. They do not employ independent engineering contractors. Their registered corporate address points directly to a single office suite in the suburbs. And as you can see on the corresponding property deed displayed on the right side of the screen, that exact office suite is the wholly owned headquarters of Rains Horizon Properties." The Human Resources Director gasped audibly, a sharp, ragged sound that echoed in the quiet room. "You are not investigating rogue vendors," I continued relentlessly, forcing him to look at the massive, undeniable proof of his own embezzlement. "You created them. You authorized massive six-figure payouts from the Transit Authority budget under the guise of field stabilization, and you routed that money directly into your personal real estate investment firm. It is a highly organized, deeply premeditated money laundering pipeline." Near the heavy wooden exit doors, the arrogant posture completely evaporated from Soren Pike. His face drained of all color, turning a sickly, translucent white. He slowly pushed his leather chair back, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor, and turned toward the brass handle of the door. He intended to slip out quietly, to run before the blast radius consumed him. He did not even manage to touch the brass handle. The heavy doors swung open inward, and two uniformed corporate security officers stepped solidly into the doorframe, crossing their arms and completely blocking his escape route. I advanced to the next slide, refusing to let the momentum slow for even a fraction of a second. A crisp, digitally signed memorandum appeared on the screen. "Mr. Pike is not going anywhere," I announced smoothly, "because his promotion depends entirely on the outcome of this meeting. This is the finalized succession memorandum. It details the immediate transfer of my title, my salary, and my project authority directly to Soren Pike. It was signed and placed into the executive queue on Thursday afternoon. The plan to replace me was fully legally executed before the weekend review even began." Soren practically collapsed back against the wall, his brand new suit suddenly looking entirely too large for his shrinking frame. At the head of the table, Celia Voss finally moved. The chief legal officer picked up the sealed envelope she had placed in front of the chief executive officer. She broke the red tamper-evident tape with a sharp, decisive tearing sound that cut through the heavy silence of the room. She pulled out a thick stack of printed papers and laid them flat. "6 months ago, my office received a highly detailed, anonymous whistleblower complaint regarding fraudulent vendor activity on the transit infrastructure project," Celia stated, her voice icy and precise, never once looking at Malcolm. "We were entirely paralyzed by a lack of hard, verifiable financial proof. I placed the internal investigation under a covert legal hold. The ownership registries and payment trails, Ms. Ward has just presented, provide the exact missing evidentiary puzzle pieces required to escalate this from a vague corporate suspicion into a highly actionable, federally prosecutable offense. Malcolm was visibly trembling now. The polished, untouchable executive armor was completely shattered. He looked wildly around the room, his eyes darting frantically for any remaining ally. He locked his gaze onto Dean Corver, the vice president of operations, who had remained entirely silent up to this point. "Dean, you know the technical requirements," Malcolm pleaded, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. "Tell them why the rollback was necessary. Tell them the system was unstable and required an immediate reset. Tell them." Dean Corver looked back at Malcolm with absolute devastating indifference. "I will not perjure myself for you, Malcolm," Dean said, his low, gravelly voice carrying a shocking finality. "I watched the execution commands register on the master administrative network. You personally ordered the server rollback at exactly 7 minutes past 12 on Friday afternoon. You intentionally destroyed the project workspace, and you did it alone." The betrayal from his own operations lead struck Malcolm like a physical bullet. He slumped back into his chair, but I was not finished. I had one final, fatal blow to deliver, and I wanted it permanently inscribed on the official recording. I tapped the tablet one last time, the screen filled with a document bearing the official Human Resources letterhead. "This is the absolute core of the conspiracy," I declared, my voice echoing with undeniable authority. "This is my official termination packet. It cites gross negligence in delivery governance as the primary cause for immediate dismissal. I recovered this document from the Hidden Human Resources directory. Look closely at the digital creation timestamp." I pointed directly at the brightly highlighted yellow text on the screen. "It was drafted, legally reviewed, and saved to the server at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Friday. That is over 3 hours before you walked into my cubicle and handed me the assignment. My total failure was entirely written, documented, and approved before I even touched a single file. You did not want me to save the project. You needed a designated scapegoat to take the fall for your massive financial crimes." On the massive remote feed monitor, the representative from the High Plains Transit Authority leaned into his microphone. His face was a mask of pure bureaucratic fury. "Ms. Ward, you have my profound gratitude for your exceptional transparency," the government liaison said, his voice completely devoid of any previous warmth. "Let the official record reflect that as of this exact moment, the $14,600,000 escrow disbursement scheduled for Tuesday morning is permanently frozen. The funds will not be released under any circumstances until a full federal investigation is concluded." That was the breaking point. The total loss of the massive Tuesday payout shattered the last remaining fragments of Malcolm's sanity. He leaped violently out of his chair, knocking it backward onto the carpet. He slammed both fists onto the mahogany table, his face contorted in absolute screaming rage. "You have absolutely no idea what you have just done," Malcolm roared, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face, entirely forgetting the blinking red light of the recording camera capturing his every move. "You stupid, arrogant fool, you think you are saving the company. If that damn log regarding the tunnel ventilation failure gets out to the public, the transit authority will rip up the entire contract. We will face massive federal safety lawsuits. I was trying to bury the defects so we could secure the funding and patch it later. You just killed the entire division." The boardroom went entirely, terrifyingly still. No one breathed. The chief executive officer stared at Malcolm with wide, horrified eyes. Celia Voss slowly picked up her silver pen and began writing methodically on her legal pad. Malcolm froze. The echoes of his own screaming voice bounced off the glass walls, ringing in his own ears. He slowly looked up at the ceiling camera, then down at the microphone sitting directly in front of him. In his blind, furious panic to attack me, he had just loudly and explicitly confessed to actively covering up a catastrophic public safety hazard in order to secure a fraudulent government payout. He had just confessed to a massive federal crime in a room full of lawyers, executives, and the very client he was attempting to defraud, all while being recorded in high definition. The sheer gravity of his own words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Malcolm Raines stared at the blinking red recording light of the ceiling camera, his chest heaving as the absolute reality of his confession violently collided with his arrogant delusion. The mask of the polished, untouchable executive disintegrated completely, leaving behind nothing but a cornered, desperate animal. With a sudden, explosive burst of panic, Malcolm lunged across the polished mahogany table. He knocked over his ceramic coffee cup, sending a dark, ugly stain spreading across the expensive wood. He threw himself toward the master audiovisual control panel embedded in the center console. His manicured hands clawed frantically at the buttons, desperately trying to kill the power to the room, to sever the remote connection, to somehow shove the catastrophic truth back into the digital shadows. He slammed the master kill switch. The massive display monitor instantly went black. The ceiling camera drooped lifelessly. The heavy electronic locks on the boardroom doors disengaged with a dull thud. Malcolm stood there, panting heavily, his tailored suit completely ruined, believing for one frantic, delusional second that he had managed to stop the bleeding. I did not move from my chair. I simply reached into my rigid leather briefcase and pulled out the 3 massive, professionally bound hard-copy dossiers I had printed at the all-night commercial shop. "You can cut the power to the entire building." "Malcolm," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy darkness of the room with absolute, terrifying calm. "It does not matter." The moment I transitioned to the second slide of my presentation, an automated script on my personal cellular hotspot mirrored the entire slide deck, the audio recording, and the verified system logs directly to the internal legal archive and the secure servers at the High Plains Transit Authority. I slid the heavy binders across the table. They stopped precisely in front of the Chief Executive Officer, the Director of Human Resources, and the Chief Legal Officer. "I brought physical copies just in case you decided to throw a temper tantrum," I added coldly. Celia Voss did not even look at the binder in front of her. The Chief Legal Officer stood up slowly, her posture radiating absolute authority. She pulled her cellular phone from her blazer pocket and pressed a single digit on her speed dial. "Execute the legal hold protocol immediately," Celia commanded into the receiver. "Seal his office, freeze his corporate accounts, lock down every single device connected to his executive credentials." She ended the call and finally looked directly at Malcolm, who was frozen in absolute terror by the control panel. "This was never a delivery review, Malcolm," Celia stated, her voice devoid of any human warmth. "This is an active evidence collection node, and you just provided the prosecution with a fully recorded, high-definition confession." The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. A team of 4 internal corporate security officers stepped inside, accompanied by 2 independent forensic data investigators. They did not ask politely. They moved with swift, silent efficiency, surrounding Malcolm and physically escorting him away from the table. He did not fight them. The sheer, overwhelming shock of his total destruction had completely paralyzed his nervous system. He was practically dragged out of the room, a hollow shell of the man who had confidently threatened my career just 3 days prior. The fallout was catastrophic and instantaneous. While we were still sitting in the boardroom, the forensic investigators systematically dismantled Malcolm's pristine corner office. Tucked behind a false panel in his lower desk drawer, they discovered a prepaid cellular phone, a stack of heavily drafted offshore banking agreements, and a small, encrypted flash drive. When the technical team cracked the drive later that afternoon, they found his personal financial ledger. The stolen Transit Authority funds matched the deposits into his real estate holding company down to the absolute final cent. Soren Pike did not possess an ounce of his mentor's deceptive fortitude. The young, arrogant executive was placed in a separate holding room with the internal legal team. He collapsed completely within the first 2 hours of questioning. Sweating profusely and weeping openly, Soren confessed everything. He admitted that Malcolm had explicitly promised him the position of senior delivery head in exchange for his absolute silence. His only required duty was to blindly sign his name to the fraudulent project takeover documents the moment Human Resources officially terminated my employment. But the stolen corporate funds were entirely overshadowed by the deleted engineering tests. The moment the High Plains Transit Authority reviewed the hidden video footage of the defective tunnel ventilation systems, the entire landscape of the crisis shifted. This was no longer a simple case of white-collar corporate embezzlement. By intentionally suppressing a critical safety failure in a public infrastructure project, Malcolm had crossed a massive, unforgivable line. The federal government stepped in aggressively. Agents from the Department of Justice swarmed our building by Wednesday morning, elevating the scandal to a severe criminal enterprise. Several months later, the federal courtroom in downtown Denver was completely silent as the judge handed down the sentence. Malcolm Raines was found guilty on multiple federal counts, including wire fraud, intentional falsification of public procurement records, obstruction of justice, and criminal conspiracy. He was sentenced to a lengthy term in a federal penitentiary, completely stripped of his wealth, his status, and his freedom. In the aftermath of the trial, a quiet, profound phrase began to circulate through the corridors of Bracken Row Systems. Whenever an executive attempted to push an unreasonable timeline or bully a subordinate with an impossible task, someone would inevitably whisper, "Don't pull a Lydia deadline." It became the ultimate corporate warning. But my victory was not complete until the collateral damage was repaired, armed with the irrefutable proof of Malcolm's systematic sabotage. I worked directly with the chief legal officer to draft official letters of exoneration. Tessa Corbin received a formal corporate apology, a massive retroactive compensation package, and her professional reputation was completely restored across the entire technology sector. Owen Hale had his full pension reinstated with interest, allowing him to officially retire with the dignity and financial security he had rightfully earned. Marisol Dane was heavily courted by our primary competitor and accepted an executive director role that paid substantially more than her previous position. The corporate ghosts who had been crushed by those impossible rescue assignments finally got their lives back. In the quiet calm that followed the storm, the chief executive officer called me into his office. He poured 2 glasses of expensive sparkling water, slid one across his desk, and formally offered me the empty chair. He wanted me to take over as the new chief operating officer. I looked at the corner office, the panoramic view of the city, and the heavy burden of the title. I shook my head and politely declined his offer. The chief executive officer looked completely stunned, but I held my ground. I told him I would only accept the promotion under one absolute, non-negotiable condition. I demanded the immediate and permanent restructuring of the entire corporate hierarchy. I required the delivery management division, the engineering validation teams, and the internal audit departments to be permanently separated into autonomous branches. They would report to entirely different executive leaders. I refused to sit in a chair that possessed the unchecked, unilateral power to manufacture a crisis. I was going to ensure that no single executive in this company would ever again possess the architectural authority to isolate an employee, strip away their resources, and weaponize a deadline for their own personal gain. He agreed to my terms, signing the structural mandate right in front of me. I had not just survived the trap, I had permanently dismantled the machine that built it. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know in the comments where you're listening from. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to Boss Revenge Stories and like the video so more listeners can find the channel.